So when you think about many of these scams, one of the specific things we're seeing in banks is muling attacks. Mm-hmm. And this is instances where accounts are opened up either by criminals themselves or by people unsuspecting of the fact that they're being scammed. Now, the reason I want to mention that is because your romance and dating scams, your investment scams, in almost all of those instances, you need a mechanism to extract money, because that's at the end of the day what it's about. I think the alarming thing that we've started to see is that if you take 100 muling accounts, nearly 30% of those are actually people themselves going and opening up those accounts, having been totally convinced of the fact that they need to transfer money, need to receive money, and maybe possibly get in a better financial position than what they are currently.
So being sort of led on a little bit to think that there's a lovely rainbow at the end of this, but unfortunately that rainbow doesn't exist.
That's right. And so the difficult thing for organizations, banks, and companies like AMP is the fact that when you're dealing with real customer information, an actual person at the end of that, where does your obligation start, stop, and your ability to influence and change that behavior? Yeah, it's a very different or interesting dilemma.
It is, and I think I think about some of the things that we are doing, and we work very closely on making sure that we've got monitoring systems from a fraud perspective that alert us around payments, mule accounts, like you mentioned, which are really about fake bank accounts being opened to move money around, which is usually used in money laundering, which again a really devastating outcome for communities because it leads to child exploitation, it leads to crime, and so working on ways that we can use AI technology, the way that we can use technology to trigger us when something isn't right is really important to us, and that's why we are obviously in partnership with GBG. I think on the flip side, education is really key.
Financial well-being, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so one of our purposes is about, making sure that we can equip Australia with financial well-being and education services. And I start to think about how do we help everyday Australians really start to understand how to treat this funky little device that looks very harmless. And starting to think about it more like we thought about our personal items, say 10 or 15 years ago, when we would carry our handbag or our wallet.
Yes.
And we wouldn't give that to anyone. If someone called us up and said, I don't know you, can you pass me your wallet? We would never do that. No. And so we need to start treating our tech assets exactly the same way, because to your point, not only is it customers unknowingly or knowingly giving that type of personal information away, we're also seeing more and more sort of first-party fraud.
Yes.
Where the person defrauding you is actually someone that you know very well.
Yes.
And that's because they've had access to your devices or your personal information. So it's really helping with the education piece there to say, this is yours and yours alone. Text messages that you receive, you should not be giving to anyone. If you receive a text message, you should be either using that text message to get into your bank account. You should not be giving that code to anyone else over the phone. And likewise, if someone calls you and they say they're from a certain department and a certain bank, call them back. Yeah. Don't take the risk. And I think the one thing that I find really devastating is that we hold internal education sessions as well across AMP around scams and fraud. We obviously have the corporate side that we really protect against, so people infiltrating our AMP assets. But then we also have a personal lens for people with their mobile phones, etc. And the sad thing that I've seen is that after those talks, I usually get 2 or 3 people that come up to me and they'll say, my sister was scammed and my brother was scammed, or a family member was scammed. And they're too embarrassed to talk about it. And they're too embarrassed to call the banks, or they're too embarrassed to tell anyone that it's happened. And by the time someone has had the conversation, it's 2 or 3 weeks later, and they've lost their life savings, or they've lost their deposit for their first home. And they're really heartbreaking circumstances. And so, I'd love to hear some of the other pieces of advice that you've heard globally that we could use for our customers as well, to say, how do we make sure from an education perspective you keep your assets safe?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing that I'd go and say is to forget the fact that this is the Nigerian prince wanting to make you rich in an email. You know, scams of that nature is not a single point event. These are highly intelligent, highly sophisticated, highly organized organizations and consortia that is driving these attempts at defraudment. And really, Australia is a very rich nation. You mentioned the funds and superannuation that is available. Well, accessibility of savings and bank accounts obviously is equally lucrative. And so the first thing is to realize that we are all targets. I love the fact that you were connecting with the phone, because you said a few years ago, keep your handbag safe. Well, it's all about gaining access to money. And so 60, 70, 80 years ago, if I wanted to steal money, all I needed was a fast horse and a balaclava, right?
Yeah, very different landscape.
And then you fast forward and we're creating more opportunity for engagement with company and consumer, and in us doing so, we're creating vulnerability.
And I do like what you said a little bit earlier in our conversation, where you were talking about a fraudster or a scam person can be located anywhere globally.
Anywhere.